Now we can get to the moment we've all been waiting for and give the conventional account of what it is to use the language. First, let's say something about what Lewis actually takes a language to be. We're mainly interested in the question of what it takes to use a particular language. But it is good, obviously, to get some sense of, well, what is a language in the first place? And Lewis, at the end of the day, basically thinks that a language is a certain kind of correspondence or relationship between strings of symbols and meanings. So in a language, obviously, crucially, there are the words and sentences that we say or write down or sign, however we express them. That's one element of a language. And those are associated with particular meanings. Sentences, words, expressions are associated with particular meanings. For concreteness, as we've been doing all along, we can take meanings of sentences just to be sets of possible worlds. And we can take meanings of names to be people, meanings of predicates to be properties. That's a basic way of thinking what's going on the meaning side of things. So we have these two things, sentences, meanings. A language is a way of mapping expressions to meanings. In some places in the paper, Lewis does describe this. In certain places in the paper, Lewis does describe a language as a set theoretic object. That's because he's specifically thinking of it as a function from sentences to meanings. That's one way to get concrete about it, but for us, what we can really just do is just think of it as a correspondence or some sort of relationship. Language is a way of assigning meanings to verbal expressions. That's the key idea here. On this conception of language, there are loads of languages. There are as many languages as there are possible ways of assigning meanings to words. So there's no interesting question of what languages are there. The interesting question is rather what determines why we're speaking one particular language rather than another. So as a matter of fact, we're speaking English. English maps expressions onto meanings in a particular way, but of course we could have spoken other languages. There are plenty of other languages that would take exactly the same expressions, exactly the same words and sentences, and map them into different meanings, pair them, combine them with different meanings. So why are we actually speaking English, which is a particular way of assigning meanings to words, rather than some other language? That's what we're trying to give an account of. Lewis's answer is that we count as speaking English because we're following a particular kind of convention. More generally, to speak a language is to follow a particular kind of convention. It's to be what he calls truthful and trusting in that particular language. Let's say what truthfulness is first. It's pretty intuitive. A community of people, a community of speakers, is truthful with respect to a language if they try to avoid saying false sentences of that language. So we would count as being truthful in English if we try to avoid saying false sentences of English. And the community is trusting in a particular language, just in case they believe that others are truthful in that language, and they come to believe the propositions expressed by people in that language. So I'm trusting in a particular language if I think you're telling the truth when you say things, and I come to believe the proposition that your sentences express in the particular language that I'm trusting in. It's worth noticing that because there's lots of different ways to map meanings onto symbols, there's lots of different ways to combine words and sentences with meanings. You could have given them different meanings. You'll be simultaneously truthful and trusting with respect to one language while not being truthful and trusting with respect to other languages. So maybe we're, as a matter of fact, truthful and trusting with respect to English. You say sentences that are on the English way of assigning meanings to those sentences true, and I come to believe the propositions that on English ways of assigning true conditions to sentences are the ones that get assigned. But there are lots of other ways of assigning meanings to the very same words that you might say, and we count as not truthful and trusting with respect to those other possible languages because you don't necessarily try to avoid saying things that are false in those other languages because you don't care about how those other languages assign meanings. And I'm not trusting in those other languages because I don't expect you to be saying things that are true in those other languages. I expect you to be saying sentences that are true in this language. And I come to believe accordingly. I come to believe the propositions that your sentences express in English and not in other possible languages that we could have thought up. That's what it is to be truthful and trusting with respect to a particular language. You try to say things that are true, you try to say sentences that are true in that language, and your audience comes to believe the propositions that your sentences express in that language. And we observe that truthfulness and trustingness are relative to particular languages. You can be truthful and trusting with respect to one language while not being truthful and trusting with respect to a whole range of different languages, because there are just so many different ways of assigning meanings to sentences. So it's a language relative concept. So that's what it means to be truthful and to be trusting with respect to a particular language. Lewis's account of what it is to use a particular language is just that there's a convention of doing both of those two things. A community, the regularities in their speech and belief, that counts as using a particular language, just in case that very same regularity is a convention of truthfulness and trustingness with respect to that particular language. That's the account. Why would you believe that this is actually how things are? Well, the way to do it is just go through the particular conditions for the convention and see, do you think they're plausible? So let's start with the first two conditions. The first condition is that you're actually doing the activity. So in this case, that means that we're actually truthful and we're actually trusting. And Lewis says that that's true because generally we are trying to say true things, or we're trying to avoid saying false things. And we do tend to believe that people are telling us the truth. We do tend to believe the things that people tell us. So that looks like we're actually performing the regularity of being truthful and trusting in English. Moreover, Lewis says, we also tend to believe that that is what everybody else is doing. We tend to believe that people tend to tell the truth, and we tend to believe that people tend to believe what they're told. I.e., we tend to believe that people are truthful and trusting in the particular language that we're speaking. The third condition for convention, as we restated it in previous videos, was that you have to have decisive reason to conform to the regularity. If everybody else is doing their part, that's a decisive reason for you to do your part, whether that means actually performing certain particular actions or coming to believe certain kinds of things. And Lewis thinks, again, this is actually something that holds in the real case. So let's think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to conform to the regularity when the regularity is one of truthfulness and trust in a language? Well, it depends on whether you're the speaker or the audience. Let's focus on the case of the audience first. To conform to the convention of truthfulness and trust in a particular language as an audience, as somebody who's listening to somebody else speaking, is just to come to believe whatever they say. Because for the audience to do their part, that's for them to be trusting. To be trusting is to believe the proposition that's expressed by the speaker in the particular language you're supposed to be speaking. And Lewis thinks that it is, as a matter of fact, true that you have decisive reason to do that. Because usually we take it that somebody saying something is pretty good evidence for its truth. If that's the case, we have good epistemic reason to then come to believe the proposition that their sentence expresses. So the audience has decisive epistemic reason to do their part in the convention of truthfulness and trustingness in English, or whatever language you're speaking. That's the case of the audience. What about the case of the speaker? Well, first of all, what is it for the speaker to have decisive reason? Well, when we're thinking about the speaker, for them to conform to the regularity is for them to try and avoid saying false things. So if they're a speaker, to try and say the truth, essentially. Why would you have decisive reason to do that? Well, Lewis thinks the speaker has decisive reason to try and say true things, given a convention of truthfulness and trustingness in a particular language, because they want the audience to have true beliefs. We in general want to communicate true beliefs to the people that we're talking to. If there is a regularity of being truthful and trusting with respect to a particular language, you know then that saying a particular sentence is a very good way to make your audience to have a particular true belief. So given that everybody else is conforming, given that everybody else is being truthful and trusting this language, that gives speakers decisive reason to say the sentences that are true, i.e. gives them decisive reason to be truthful in the language. So that's why Lewis thinks the third condition is met. People have, given that they expect everybody else to be conforming, both the audience and the speaker have decisive reason to do their part in the convention. For the audience, that means they have decisive reason to believe what they're being told, or to believe the proposition that's being expressed by the sentence in the relevant language. For the speaker, this means saying sentences that are true in the relevant language. The audience has decisive reason to believe what they're being told because they have good reason to believe what they're being told is true. The speaker has good reason to say the things that are true because they want to impart true beliefs to the audience. And saying sentences that are true in this particular language is a good way to do that, given that everybody else is conforming to truthfulness and trustingness in this particular language. What about the fourth condition? Well, the fourth condition said that that everybody should prefer everybody to conform to the regularity over slightly less than everybody conforming. Does this hold in language use? Do we prefer everybody to be truthful and trusting in a particular language rather than everybody being slightly less than everybody being truthful and trusting in language? And I think the obvious answer here is yes, because if everybody conforms, then we'll have more true beliefs, people are more reliable. That's sort of a good outcome that we all desire. If people conform less than perfectly, that leads to less true beliefs, leads more people saying false things. The first seems clearly preferable to the second. So the fourth condition, that everybody prefers everybody conforming to slightly less than everybody conforming to the convention of truthfulness and trustingness, that seems met too. The fifth condition said that there has to be more than one possible regularity that has the conditions that we've talked about so far. So not only is the regularity that's happening, does it fulfill the conditions we met so far, but there are other equally good ways of doing that. And again, that's clearly true here. As we said, there are loads of different languages. It's really easy to come up with a language. Any way of taking all the sentences and words and assigning the meanings, that counts as a language in Lewis's sense. And there's nothing intrinsically better to say English than any other way we might have assigned meanings to the words in English. From the point of view of sheer communication, the various different possibilities are equally good. To compare actual languages, English is not necessarily any better a solution to the problem of trying to communicate with each other than, say, French is, or German, or any other language. All languages seem equally good at communicating the things that we want to communicate. So it looks like the fifth condition is met. Whenever people are speaking a particular language, it's not the case that that's the only language that could have fulfilled the other conditions for convention. Being truthful and being trusting in other languages would be an equally good way to get the result that everybody wants. Finally, there's the common knowledge requirement. Lewis doesn't really say much about the common knowledge requirement, but it seems kind of plausible enough. It's not an obvious weak point in the account. So we'll just sort of grant it, although if you have questions about it, you should definitely ask. We've now seen the conventional account of language use, according to Lewis. We started by saying what a language is. It's very easy to come up with a language. A language is just a way of pairing strings, expressions, words, those kinds of things. It's a way of pairing those things with meanings. So there are going to be lots of languages. There are lots of different actual languages, but there are even more possible languages that aren't actually being spoken. Given that that's what a language is, the interesting question is, well, what makes it the case that, say, our community speaks English rather than French, and that other communities speak French rather than English, and rather than the whole, well, what will actually be an infinity of possible languages? What determines that English is the language that we speak? Lewis's answer is that when you think about the regularity that is the way that we speak, those sentences that we utter, and the beliefs that audiences form in response to those sentences, that is a convention of being truthful and trusting in English. It's a convention of trying to avoid saying sentences that are false when given their English meanings. And it's a convention of believing the propositions expressed by sentences in English when they're said by people speaking to you. To speak a language is just to be acting regularly in such a way that constitutes a convention of truthfulness and trustingness with respect to that language.